So hello everyone and welcome to our fourth webinar in this series titled Getting Results, Leading Teams and Talent. So on the call today, you've got three people here to help you. I'm Dane Anderton. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Manchester Executive Education and also Programme Director for the programme from which we've taken this session today. On the call as well is my colleague Paul Evans. Paul?
Morning, everybody. My name is Paul Evans. I'm a lecturer at the and faculty of the University of Manchester with the Business School, specialising in executive education. I've been with the Business School for a number of years, since 2012, but before that, I was a senior executive in both the public and the private sector.
Thank you very much, Paul. And also on the call today is Kieran McCord.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm Kieran. I work alongside Dane and Paul, and I'm responsible for recruitment and promotion of our open leadership programs. And I'll be taking questions in the chat pane today, so we can have a bit of a Q&A session at the very end. So any questions, please just write them in the group chat, and I'll pick them up and we'll go through them later on.
Thank you very much, guys. Thank you. So if we press on now, what I'm going to do is a brief introduction, first of all, in terms of our leadership development programs that we run here and why we've taken this session in particular to show you today. And that session it will focus on leading teams and talent. And we will have time for question and answer at the end of this session. So please use the chat function to send us your questions, and those will be taken at the end. So in terms of our leadership development, the University of Manchester have been doing this for quite some time now. One of the world leaders in executive education, especially through things like our global MBA. We've just entered our apprenticeship network, but we have a whole suite of bespoke leadership programs and what we call open programs from which we have taken today's session from. So one thing that we like to say here is that leadership is not a skill set that you can just kind of learn along the way, but it's something that you need across all sectors, across all industries in order to survive. If you look at current government reports, look at current reports from the Office for National Statistics, the Industrial Strategy, for example, there are clear indications that leadership and management are essential factors to successful productivity and also successful organizations. So we've designed programs which are designed to accelerate leadership skilling. So just go on to the next slide. So we think that by using our programs like the today's session, they are designed to accelerate how managers and leaders think strategically. How can we enable your existing capabilities to be redesigned to become dynamic capabilities, if you like, or discover new capabilities within your organization? And it's about mastering challenges and opportunities. So we don't want to kind of sit you in a room and think about how company X and 300 miles around the world is doing X, Y, and Z. Yes, that might be a good example, but what we want to do is take your real world experiences, your current roles, your current experiences, opportunities, issues, challenges that you have within your organizations and look for that impact. How can you personally have impact? And that's how we design these programs, and that's what today's session is about. It's about focusing on the now and also the future, so we have a much more sustainable future. And I don't just mean sustainable in terms of environmental, but in terms of that economic sustainability, how we might have impact societally and also on the environment as well. So on my next slide, again, I made reference to the industrial strategy. Greater Manchester, for example, where we are based, have a local industrial strategy. And again, all the evidence is pointing to that good productivity, good organizations have good quality practices in management and leadership. And this can increase organizational performance. All the data is pointing in that direction. So we are gearing ourselves up. We are in that position to kind of offer bespoke, but also our open programs and tailored programs towards the industrial strategy and ensuring that your organization gets what it needs. So, as I said before, we've taken today's session from the Manchester Leadership Development Programme, and this is a programme which focuses on 5 core days around leadership teams, finance, strategy, innovation, and project management. So what we're saying here is we're going to give you all the kind of key cornerstones of an organization. Focus on you, focus on your team, focus on how we give that strategic vision to an organization, but also focusing on project management, which is about how we actually do the change, how we actually bring all this together. And I'm glad to have Paul on the call today to help us work through the one particular session, taster of teams and leading teams today. So I'm not going to go through these in much detail, but this is what we aim to do on that Manchester Leadership Development Programme, just to give you some context before Paul comes on. In our 5-day program, we look at kind of personal leadership using a psychometric. So Paul's session, if you like, can sometimes build on that, and how then you as a leader can influence that team and other stakeholders. But we also go through things around financial management, giving you that language, that competency to have those conversations and that knowledge within your organisation. We bring that together in terms of a strategic focus, looking at strategic decision making and innovation capabilities. But key to this is how we actually implement that change, and that is through projects, short-term projects, which kind of bring about that change. So together we want to look at these 5 core functions and allow you to apply some knowledge, skills and behaviours into your organisation that you take from this course. So just to give you a brief overview of what we do, those are the core 5 functions in leadership. We actually attach an ILM qualification to this, and we also give you leadership coaching should you wish to take that as well. So again, we're looking at here how we can actually have that kind of knowledge, the skills and the behaviours, doing things in real world situations, applying it to your situation. I hope that's what we can do today, again, in this very short session. And just a kind of quick note here around the opportunities and possibly challenges that you're currently facing under the COVID-19 situation. There's a lot of talk at the moment about, do we just go back to business as usual? Do we just continue, try and get back to things as normal? Well, I would say no, it's more of an opportunity here to hit the reset button and not just kind of recover, but recover and transform. I think that's the one thing some businesses might be missing out here is, how can I transform to adapt to new challenges that are coming around now and the way in which people are changing their societal behaviours. So we can go back to business as usual, or can we go to better business and transform? That's kind of something to take away today from this, and something that we are very conscious of at Alliance Manchester Business School in our research, in our teaching in executive education, and something I want to distill today. Is there an element of not just recovery, but recovery and transformation? Okay, so I want to hand over now and welcome Paul Evans to take the reins now and take us through leading teams and talent. Over to you, Paul. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dane. Morning, everybody. So, if we can just drop down to the first slide, please, guys. Thank you very much. I just wanted to reiterate the Dane's sentiment about doing something different, using COVID as a rationale for doing something different, but doing something better, something more sustainable. And I'm going to advocate a leadership in practice which I think is much more sustainable, because it's much more grounded in our lived experiences and in our lived realities. It's something that's available to each and every one of you to do. Is that sometimes is that we look at leadership and we look at the rarefied sort of like sense of leadership and the leaders that are around us and sort of say, oh, if only I could be like that, then I would be much more successful and things around would be successful too. And I think that's a mistake, is that each and every one of us has got a capacity within us in order to be able to lead. It's just that we do it in our own particular style. And I think as well is that what we have a tendency to do is that we tend to think or see leadership as being something which is really complicated. And it is complicated. And so in order to deal with the complexity, we filter it down and we make it something which is simple, around, I don't know, 4 factors or something along those lines, or just say that it's about the vision or about the charisma, whatever they might be. And I have a tendency really to think about what you do on a day-to-day basis and how we can make that more effective, but also to embrace the complexity. It is a complex phenomenon, just learn to deal with it. But you are uniquely equipped as human beings in order to be able to deal with levels of complexity. And one of the things that I would wish to try and explore with you in a workshop type scenario is how best that you can do exactly that. Now you'd start with your building blocks from, and I don't know if any of you picked up on the presentation by my colleague Courtney Owens earlier on in this series, where Courtney talks about your psychological building blocks, if you like, you know, those skills and traits that you have. Well, they're the things that determine the kind of like style that you're going to adopt. But using that is that you can then move into negotiating elements of complexity in order to actually come up with well, you could argue if you're an authentic framing of leadership, which is about yourself, because you can only do what you do. You can't do what somebody else does. That's what I refer to as karaoke leadership, is where you just copy somebody else's or hope to learn by copying somebody else. You don't need to do that, but an appreciation of self is really integral or essential for your leadership performances. So on that basis, then let's try and put this idea into some more of a team working framework. So drop down, please, Kieran. Okay, so let me ask you a question. Have you worked in a team that was less than effective? I'll give you a couple of minutes to let that sink in. So let's now think about the reasons why that might be less effective. I see that somebody's chatted in with a big yes. So just drop down then, Kieran. So let's have a look at the reasons for its ineffectiveness.
Well, Paul, do you want me to run the poll now?
I want to explain what the various criteria are first before we run the poll, if that's all right.
Absolutely. Okay.
Yeah. So let's do that. So one of the reasons why teams are ineffective is a lack of trust. And what we mean in this is a lack of trust in your colleagues in the team to do what they're supposed to do when they're supposed to do it, as well as a lack of trust in the leader and the kinds of leadership that are being displayed, are being put on display. Next one. Too much conflict. Teams are riven with conflict, different competing ideas. Everybody wants to sort of like justify their own ideas. And also, I think that the conflict element means that there is an element that we don't want to necessarily upset. So on somebody that's in the team, possibly the leader, who would be the nominal leader, the sort of like the higher important person, or the hippo, the highest paid person in the room. And we might not want to upset them. So we kind of like hedge our behaviours, or we keep our opinions very much to ourselves so we don't upset anybody. But all that just leads to is a lot of posturing and time wasting. So conflict is very much an element that's inherent within teams. Next one, lack of commitment to the team in terms of like what it's trying to do. There can be, if you like, a form of social hedging, is that we'll hedge what we do, or we'll sit back and we'll watch to see what occurs, and then we'll contribute and get involved if things are going our way. If it's not, then we'll sort of like withdraw a little bit and see what happens. A lack of commitment. Another one, lack of accountability. And this really just is less about accountability of the outcomes and those sorts of things. This is more about accountability in terms of individual behaviours, is that individual behaviours don't get taken to task. One of the things that we do know that really upsets people within organisations is when poor performing behaviour or poor performances are never really addressed. People seem to get away with it, for want of a better word. So that's what we mean by accountability. And then the next one is little focus on the results, is that it tends to be very ego-driven. People bring their own agendas, and we don't focus upon what the actual the rationale for the team was in the first place. And then the last one, which I've included as well, which is by way of a catch-all thing, is all of the above. So we can actually take your opinions. I know that some of you have been chatting in and wanting to share your opinions on this already, but we could run a poll, can we not, Kieran?
Yes, we can, Paul. So I'm sure most of you will be familiar with this. So the poll is launching now. You should be able to see on your screen a few of those options that Paul's talked about. So you can choose more than one, but actually if you go through, just read through what are those reasons in your experience that teams have been ineffective. So this is really based on your own experience. Well, I've got a lot of votes coming in. And at the end of the poll, I will share it so we can all talk about it, and Paul will take you through some of the results.
Are we going to wait for the results to come through, or do you want me to just press
absolutely. I'm just going to give it. We probably need another maybe 20 seconds.
All right. Okay. Well,
most people have voted.
Another 20 seconds.
Any last minute people going or want to vote out there?
Get your votes in, people.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to be closing the poll in about 5 seconds. 3, 2, 1, and we're closed. So now, are you ready for the results? It's an interesting result here, Paul. Let's see what the results are.
Accountability, conflict, and trust. That's interesting. I mean, in many respects, actually, it's pretty much across the board, isn't it? There's sort of like not one that's more dominant than the other. So, well, sorry, it's the accountability and lack of trust. That's interesting. I've taken these dimensions from a book which is called The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And the whole premise of the book is that team working is based upon trust and trusting. And I would look to explore with you within a workshop environment exactly what we mean by trust, because we say that, oh, we need to trust, as if it's not very problematic. And of course, trust is problematic, because how do you know when you can trust somebody? You can only trust somebody up to the point where you can't trust anybody, and then it's too late, isn't it? And it's quite difficult to trust, and it's quite difficult to cultivate and to maintain trust, because it's very ephemeral. Trust can be broken very, very easily. But that's interesting, right across the board, but common. You know, we've all had experiences of poor performing teams or less than effective teams, I think will be fair. Let's move on and let's address some of these issues. Because what's interesting is that despite evidence to the contrary, that we find team working quite difficult, 94% of organizations use teams. I struggle with this because I can't think of a kind of like an organizational firm that doesn't use teams. You might be able to help me out, and we could also talk about this within a workshop as well. I think it'd probably be closer to 100%. But anyway, a lot of organizations use teams. Which is sort of a bit paradoxical, because the fact that the teams don't function as well as perhaps they ought to do, but we rely upon teams quite a lot within our working environment. So there is a kind of like a requirement that we can run these things better. The idea about teams is that effective teamwork is the secret behind growth and success, which is a pretty glib point, I think it is. But the notion is that teams and team working, by bringing people together of different backgrounds and different experiences, is that you widen the experience and people can learn from each other. Consequently, therefore, teams break down the barriers, and it provokes innovation, and it promotes effective working. It's experiential in that respect, is that we can use and build upon the experiences of other people within the group in order to produce something which is novel and innovative. Okay, Kieran, please. So if we go back a step a little bit and just look at some of the thinking in and around teams, is that a lot of team working models, if you like, are what I would refer to as IPO models, inputs, processes, and outputs. Is that we determine what the inputs are through context, your industry, the task that's at hand, the size of the team and the composition, and we can manage that, I guess, quite nicely. The things like domain and industry would always be set. And then through the processes is that we deliver the outputs. Efficiency is an interesting word. I'd like to eradicate it completely from organizational functioning, but nevertheless, efficiency of self and of others, the outcomes that we determined at the beginning of the process, the task, what are the outcomes, the resources and resource allocation, the innovations, and also how we might apply those innovations. And through these inputs to get to the outputs, we've got these processes in the middle there, which take one to determine the other. Those processes about clarity and participation, motivation, orientation, support, communication, and sharing. And my guess is that they are all words that you're all very, very familiar with, because they are endemic within traditional, or what I might describe as normative, assumed models of processes of leadership that we should be engaging in. So just drop down is that I'll just put that point up there, please, Kieran, is that what we're talking about is leadership. Okay, within the models of team functioning, the gap between inputs and outputs is leadership, but we're not very clear about the kinds of leadership that we're talking about. Okay, is that there is an assumption that individual or individualistic leadership works in a team environment. And I'm not sure that that's particularly true or accurate or very useful. This as a process is interesting, but it's not very useful. And what I would be much more interested in doing with you as delegates on a particular program is working with you to find stuff that's useful to you, not just necessarily is interesting. Is that organizations have a tendency to frame models of leadership, which have got lots and lots of different competencies, and then say, there you go, get on with that. And if you do that, you'll be a fantastic leader. Which, drop down, please, Kieran, is typified by this. Now that surprised me, actually, this slide, because my friend Kieran has redeveloped this slide for me. It's not like the way that I presented it, but no, this is much better. It's because I'll just give you a minute just to read through what clear leadership involves. So, if you remember, right at the very, very beginning, I said that leadership is complex. And by the very nature of this description in terms of what clear leadership looks like in a team environment, it's complex. It's, if you like, it's an do everything well model. All you have to do to manage teams is do everything well. And just like with the IPO kind of model before, that's interesting, but it's not very helpful. Is that, you know, you as an individual are going to be good at some of these things and less so at perhaps some of the other things that's in there. But you could just see that in order to be able to manage teams, you need to share objectives, increase enthusiasm and excitement, optimism, and so on and so on and so on and so forth. There's an enormous amount of work to be considered in bringing teams together, which of course might well explain some of the reasons why teams are not as effective as perhaps we would like them to be as well. Okay, Kieran, please. Now, I want us to just reflect upon something here, which is outside of the norm, I guess, is that, as I said earlier, organizations tend to have a series of traits and behaviors which comprise leadership models, and then you say, well, get on with that. And if you can do all of that, then you'll be the kind of like leader that we want to do. I'd like to counter that by suggesting that we are all, by our very natures, incomplete. You are incomplete. Certainly when I was leading in organizations, and I think it's worth pointing out, is that I'm a much better leader now that I don't actually have to do any. But is that whilst I was a leader, is that I recognized, but probably a little bit too late, the nature of my own incompleteness. And I think that there is a pressure upon a lot of us in order to be able to sort of conform to the expectations of what leadership looks like. As a colleague of mine once described, is that there's an intention that we should all become Mary Poppins leaders or Mary Poppins managers, which is practically perfect in every way. And that, if I may be so bold as to suggest, that's not you. You are a mixture of flaws. You are a mixture of strengths and weaknesses. You are a mixture of skills and relative less skillful areas. And that's fine. You're human. Just learn to deal with it. Understanding where your strengths are and where your weaknesses are. And this is part of the psychometric and the Hogan test that was outlined to you by Courtney in an earlier session, comes into play. This is the foundation of your leadership style, but also is the foundation of you appreciating your own incompleteness. So I just want to put that to one side, this idea of an incomplete leader for the time being, because I'm going to come back to it in another, when I conclude at the end. Because what we need to address now, and hopefully the idea about being incomplete it takes away some of the pressure as well. You know, if what you do is that I'm the complete leader, the Mary Poppins type manager, I've got all of the answers, puts an enormous amount of pressure on the individual, and maybe that's ameliorated some of it a little bit more. I hope so. Anyway, that was the intention of it. Not to sort of like point a finger at you and say, well, you're incomplete, because we all are, okay? So let's move away from that for a little bit, and let's think about the task that we're dealing with when we're working within teams. Why do we put teams together in the first place? Well, invariably, teams are put together in order to try and resolve a problem or to look at a particular problem within a problematic. It might not be a problem which is detriment to functioning, but it might be something that's identified as a relative weakness that we can make better. And I can think about in my own experiences as working within the university, is that there are 3 working parties, teams, that are being established in order to be able to look at how we might do something better in the future. But inevitably, if what we're doing is that we're looking at doing something differently, we are looking at innovations and novelties. So the kind of tasks that we're being asked to do within teams are pretty, they're undetermined. If we knew, if the task was relatively simple, the kind of like the language that gets used is with it was a simple task or a wicked task. Have you heard that before? The idea about wicked tasks and wicked problems. If they were simple, would we really need to put a team together in order to be able to resolve that? Because really, in a simplistic kind of framing, is that the problem is something that we've seen before, and as a consequence, we can resolve we know what the answer is. If, however, the problem is about dealing with something new or about making something better, is that this is something that we've not seen before. And as a consequence of that is that we don't really know what the answer is. Now, this is, I think, a challenge for people that are put into leadership positions, because A, you're incomplete. And one of the things that makes us incomplete is our own experiences, which of course is a strength, but nevertheless trying to just apply those experiences to problems that have not seen before can create more problems than they try and resolve. But that's the idea of leadership, isn't it? The leader leads. It's interesting if we look at some of the debates that are occurring across the pond in America and an absence of a leadership, is that broadly speaking is what they're talking about in terms of strong leadership is, can you please tell us what to do? Now that might be a problem when the group is faced with something which is wicked. It's a wicked problem. And I think that because of expectations within the group environments is that we want somebody to lead us here, is that the leader steps in and becomes that strong leader and forgets all about leadership and starts to command. And then when people start to command, then you get things like a breakdown in trust, you get lack of commitment and so on and so forth. Is really the model of leadership, which is about very individualistic. It's about me as a leader and I impose or I sell my view to the group, is one way of doing it, but it's a commanding way of doing it, and it might not be the best way of doing it. And certainly I would argue that in an environment where things are changing very, very quickly, and that we are faced with a number of different problems, I would argue that it's very much the wrong framing of leadership, and what we need to do is we need to think about a different way of working, a different way of leading. Would you mind dropping down, please, Kieran? So I just want to introduce this model to you. I like the model, although it's fair to say that it's been widely criticised. Is that it's Tuckmans' FourStage model, and it's been around since, I don't know, the old Queen died, I think. It was the early 1960s, I think it was originally brought out. And Tuckman's idea is that all groups, teams, go through 4 distinct phases. Is that they form, so they go through the process of forming, and then they storm. So we all fall out. We try and say, well, no, this is what we should do. That's what we should do. This is how we're going to do it, and so on and so forth. And then we store. So we do that storming process. But then what we do as a consequence of it is that we develop norms, rules of behavior, expectations. And once we've done that, we've arrived at it, is that we can therefore perform. We can get on with the job. But there needs to be this forming, storming, norming period before we get on with doing the forming. Now, what people have pointed out as being the inaccuracies in this model is that process of storming goes on forever for the length of the team. So in some cases, we might allow people to storm, and then we say, right, let's get on with it. And so now we'll crack on with it. But a lot of the issues that have been voiced, or the issues that were brought up in that storming, forming and norming phase, never get dealt with again. They never get effectively resolved. So I would argue that despite what we've seen so far in our and a lot of our lived experiences, is that a particular role of a leader is to allow, or is to manage that storming phase. Okay, because in managing that storming phase, is what that leader is attempting to do, or is bringing about, is what I would describe as the identity of a team. Is there a point that makes that, Kieran? Is there an animation? Just drop down. Yeah. Are we a team? And this is really the nub of it, is that teams are teams really when they start to talk about themselves as we the team, not I'm in a team. That's not the team. When the group vocabulary describes themselves as a team, is that they've identified that team as being a cohesive unit. The identity has been established. The storming processes which go on from the whole lifetime of the team seek to almost break down that framing of identity. So the leader, therefore, really needs to be cognizant with that, and also help establish the identity of the team, keep it as a team in itself. So one of the primary roles, therefore, of the leader is to resolve the problems of the team, to address those issues of accountability and commitment, to bring people together. But also it then becomes much, much easier for a leader to be able to represent the team to different stakeholders, and so on and so forth. So whilst this idea of trust is there as being at the forefront of team functioning, and okay, I can accept that to an extent, I think that trust is such a problematic, is that the idea of identity is something which is much more noticeable, because it's actually something which is referred to in the way that the people within the team talk about themselves on a day-to-day basis. And it's very clear evidence, therefore, as to how the team is functioning. Drop down, please, Kieran. So let me try and sum up some of the things that I've talked about here. Is that leadership resides with the group. So leadership is not a one person by necessity requirement. There will be somebody that is going to be a nominal leader of the group, but actually they need to be aware of the fact that at time that they are by definition incomplete, and there may well be other people within the team that are better equipped to deal at that moment in time. And there is a requirement, therefore, to defer to somebody else was in there. Is that leadership, therefore, is less seen as being the function of an individual, but actually can be seen as being a function within the group. Providing that something is doing the leadership, does it matter if it's one person or if it's somebody that is, or if it's the group? If you are motivated by attaining a set of objectives, you might not necessarily object to that. If, however, you are seeing leadership as being an opportunity in order to be able to develop your own perspective, your own visibility within the organization, is that perhaps then what you're doing is that you're tending towards more of an individualistic sense of leadership, which will, to all intents and purposes, give rise to the possibilities that you as a leader are limiting the effectiveness of the team in order to be able to deliver those determined outputs. So there's no need for a specific head. It can change. I'll just give you a very, very quick example, is that a friend of mine, Lindsay, used to be the director of the National Science Museum in London. And they used to do sleepovers. So you get a group of kids, they'd hire a gallery and they'd sleep over. And Lindsay decided that one day he would come down and he would take part in one of these sleepovers. He was interested to see what was going on. Well, he got there and they're all run by junior staff and they immediately deferred to him. And he said, hang on a minute, I've never done this before. I've no idea how this works. Why don't you just show me and I'll just act as a customer? So he deferred his position of leadership and allowed the people that knew what they were doing to do the job properly, okay? That's what I mean by no need for a specific head. I accept that in terms of accountabilities and responsibilities, there will always be a nominal head, but the nominal head needs to know when their own experiences are deficient and defer to somebody else that's got a better understanding. If you think about the team environment in which we're working in, is that as a generalist, it might be that I am misrepresenting somebody from either a marketing, operations or a finance perspective. And if we're dealing with something which has got financial requirements, maybe that would be the appropriate time for me to defer to somebody and allow them the space to be able to lead at that stage. But what I'm not suggesting here is that the leader just abdicates the responsibilities and says, just get on with it, you know, or it's very sort of, I don't know, liberal in terms of like a framing, and it's a very sort of pleasant experience to be, because it's very free and so on and so forth. Is that the things have it's a bit like managing a blancmange, isn't it? Is that you sort of like, you can sort of squash here and a bit might pop out there and so on and so forth. Is that the leader's responsibility, the nominal leader, the head of, is really to establish the parameters. So if you can establish the parameters within which the team is going to work and it's agreed upon, then effectively that team will, not without management or without leading, but at least there is an expectation of where we're going, because the parameters of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, particularly with relation to task, have been established at the early forming and norming and storming stage. Resolve the problems with the team. And I think that as a point I've not yet made, so I'll make this point now, is that who should be in a team? Well, anybody that is actually going to be impacted or their representative by the decisions that are going to be made. That way you're going to get much broader buy-in. So somebody that's trying to resolve an issue in a wider organization, but is exclusively just is made up of a population of finance people, there's likely to be some resistance to any decision that's going to get made that comes out of it. So if we can cultivate an idea that we bring more people in that are actually responsible or are going to be impacted by decisions that are going to be made, there's a fair chance, therefore, that the team will establish that identity, but more so that at the end of it is that whatever is decided upon is going to be enacted upon. But remembering, therefore, that the leader, the nominal leader, needs to resolve the problems or needs to work with the group to resolve the problems. You don't need the answers, but you need to be able to cultivate a style of working which allows, which fosters problem solving. So use the team, use the resources that you've got at your disposal. Don't feel that it's all down to the individual to resolve issues. And critically, that underpinning notion of successful teams, and I have to say there is a ton of work that's out there that says that teams are effective, that groups are not. And the only difference I can think about about what constitutes a team is the team has got that sense of identity. They refer to themselves as a team, not just as a loosely formed group or as a member. I am in a team. We are a team. There's a massive difference there between the way that people refer to themselves, and resolving the problems helps maintain this framing of identity. Just drop down, please, Kieran. So at this stage, I've got another questionnaire for you, or another poll, because one of the real differences when you look at effective functioning of teams is that an effective team environment reflects very much upon its own performance, about where it is, what it's doing. Now, this isn't just let's have a get together and we'll set an agenda and we'll talk about items one, where are we with this? That's kind of like performance measurement. Reflection and team reflection is a much deeper investigative intervention, where people come together in order to be able to ask questions and to resolve issues and to talk about what do we know, where are we going, how do I feel. And there are lots and lots of models of reflection that's out there, but I'd like to ask you, can we put the poll up, please, Kieran? Just do this.
Okay, so the poll's live, Paul?
Pardon?
The poll is live now.
Thank you very much. So let's have a look at it. When you've worked in a team, how often would you take time to reflect? Now, I mean this true reflection that is about dealing with what happened, what's happening, what do we know, how do we feel, and so on and so forth, as opposed to just let's have a progress report. I'd be interested to see. So if you vote now, and let's see how that comes about.
Okay, so the voting's still going. We probably got about 70% of the folks in the audience. A few more. We'll give it a couple more seconds. Okay, I think that's everybody who's going to vote. So I'm going to close the polling now. And you should be seeing the results now, Paul.
Okay, never. Fifth of us, never. That's interesting. Occasionally. And yeah, that's interesting. Within a workshop environment, I would want us to, I would work with you in order to try and refine these notions of reflection and reflexivity. The reason being is that this is really, as adults, how we learn, and how groups of people can come together in order to be able to learn effectively. And learning, of course, means that we change behaviors and we do something differently. Theoretically, we learn something which allows us to do something better. But reflection really sits at the core of your own leadership, but also sits very much as a critical essential of effective team working. But as you know, as leaders of that team working, is that teams will not reflect unless the nominal leader says, let's have a period. I mean, you wouldn't call it reflection, but let's just have a get together and see where we are. And again, we can work on the language in terms of how we might go about doing that. But if you think about it, these reflective processes not only can keep the cohesiveness and the identity of the team and help resolve the problems, but one of the outcomes that it will do is it'll maintain levels of trust. I think trust has often been given this causal relationship, but I see it much more as an outcome of effective team behavior. Okay, well, the one thing I want to leave you with, I'll leave you with that model. If you do, you can follow that round. There are loads of these models out there. I'll leave that as a model. And if you think about when we have reflected, do we do all of these bits and pieces? Or is it more of a kind of like a performance review? I know in my own experiences is that most of the stuff that I've always done has been sort of performance reviews. And I would advocate for much more deeper reflexive investigations and conversations as being the sort of like the glue that helps teams identify as team, but also the oil that helps lubricate processes. And as I say, I'd focus upon that in workshops with you. So thank you very much for listening. I'm very happy to take any questions if there are any questions out there.
Thank you very much, Paul. So Kieran has been collating the questions, so I'll hand over to Kieran now to feed some of those through. Thank you.
Well, it's more comments at this stage. So I'll read out a couple of the comments. We had Lee talking about leadership neglect is one of the areas that undermines team performance. Very interesting there.
What do you mean by that, Lee, in terms of leadership neglect? Do you mean that the leader sets the team up, then clears off?
I think I'm unmuted now.
We can hear you, Lee.
Yeah. Generally, yeah.
Yeah.
The leader says, a leader's got too many. Okay, a scenario here is where you've got remote offices, but the team or the group is spread across the remote office, and you've got teams within those offices. So you've got a hierarchical leader who then neglects leaders of the teams. Just basically saying, do this, do that, do this, do that. And then they're like thinking, what?
Yeah. Well, that's a good example of command, but it's also wrapped up into sort of, or another terrible leadership behavior, which is, I think it would be fair to say that we don't like being micromanaged, which is the command type stuff. But then at the opposite end of it is the macro management, is that somebody just hovers around in the ether up there, but they don't actually really get engaged. And there's a temptation where the team is not co-located to engage in those forms of behaviours. And I couldn't agree with you more, Lee, is that leadership as very often, or as within my vernacular, leadership's a full contact sport. And if you're going to lead, you need to be there with people on a much more frequent basis than perhaps leaders tend to be.
That's where it worries me a little bit about Zoom and the transition of people using Zoom and stuff and other networking things, that it could potentially create more neglect.
I agree with you. As I said, the idea of networked and co-located teams is something which is non-co-located teams is something that has been almost invariably ignored in training and development scenarios, educational scenarios. I've got some perspectives on that, and within a workshop, I'd wish to share them with you.
Well, that's another question, Paul, that's come in from Mustafa, this question about what do we think the impact on teams from this remote working? Obviously, you could put a whole workshop together just on that, but any thoughts?
Well, I think that Lee has summed it up quite nicely, is that this would be one of the reasons why I'd like to ban efficiency from organisational functioning and replace it with effective, is that helicopter leadership and Zoom conferences are efficient, but they're not very effective in getting a team to work together. So the leader needs to appreciate themselves as being embedded within a network and operate accordingly, as opposed to seeing themselves as, and I think Mustafa's point about being, sorry, it might not have been Mustafa, it could have been Lee's point, about operating as the apex of a hierarchy, is very much a command and control framing of leadership based around our own sense of what a leader is. Networks function in a much different, in a much different way, in that each individual within a team is a node. Okay, and it's less about the node itself and more about the flows of information that go between the nodes that actually bring about the cohesiveness and the sense of identity, and therefore its own effectiveness. But it's a different kind of approach when you're dealing with something which is not co-located.
Thank you, Paul. Great comment from Deborah. Something that I think a lot of people have come across: inconsistency of leaders' behaviour damages trust and performance. Any perspectives on that?
Well, I couldn't agree with Deborah more, actually. As and this is why I talk about trust as written about as being something which is not problematic. And of course, it is intensely problematic if my behaviour is inconsistent. So I would get rid of trust and I would replace it with consistency. Back in the dark and distant past, as I used to work for Whitbreads, which we used to manage pubs, and I was a young area manager down on the south coast of England, and an old lag, if you like, basically told me, he said, you can have two impacts when you go into this particular business. Which one do you want to have? One is that you can wind people up and piss them all off. And the other one is that you can motivate them, you can help them. Well, if you start from that particular environment where I can help them and motivate people, is that it does require you to center your own approach and to be consistent. Because as soon as you're outside of that, as soon as you do something different, which is outside of expectations, people will say, I told you, I knew he was a so-and-so, and therefore the trust has gone. Consistency, if you are consistent in the way that you behave, I know how you will respond when I tell you something. Therefore, I can trust you. If you behave in completely random and inconsistent ways, I'll actually be careful about what I tell you, when I tell you, and if really, I'll try and get somebody else to tell you, because you have a tendency to shoot the messenger, and that's inconsistent, and I don't trust you. So yes, Deborah, I agree with you entirely.
Brilliant answer, Paul. I love the links between consistency and trust. A question from Shanta. Good morning, Shanta. Is this about character as well? Is this about leaders' character, or I guess team members' character as well?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I made reference to the webinar that Courtney did with you all, where she talks about your personality and your personality makeup, which is in essence is your character. And I think that it's a good question, because really, I want to say is that not everybody that leads ought to, because they might be of a deficient kind of character. But on the basis of that is that I would still argue that everybody has got the capacity to lead within their own character. It's just that their style might be different to somebody else's. But what we have a tendency to do is to say that, well, there is a style that we want you to adopt. And there are two different perspectives to that. Is that one, we've got a style which comprises a lot of different sorts of behaviors and competencies, and we do that. And that's a bit like, it's a kind of randomness principle, isn't it? Is that there's so many things that are in there, is that actually we don't know which one of those things is more important than any of the others. So we just say, we'll get on with it. And the other thing is that we're saying, do all of these things, which is a bit like being hammered into shape to fit. Well, if we do that, we lose our own sense of our own authenticity, don't we? Is that I can only be the kind of leader that I am. But if I'm aware of my character flaws and my character strengths, I can compensate for that through reflective processes. But I can also bring people into my team which says, they might turn around to me and say, don't do that. Or can you do a bit more? We need you to do this. I need you to do that today, and so on and so forth. So your character, those building blocks, those psychological traits, those behaviors that you have, those characters are really important. Are really important to your character. And just one last point I'd like to mention out in this particular instance as well is that because of the way that we have a tendency to review people's performances within our own organizations, is that we have a tendency to say to them, you need to do X, Y, and Z because you're not good in these particular areas. So build on the weaknesses. There's probably a fair chance that however many of you are out there, are well aware of what you're not very good at. And there's a reason for that you're not very good at it. I know exactly what I'm not very good at, is that my boss told me 25 years ago. Guess what? I'm still not very good at them now. But how many of you know what you're good at? And that's one of the values of taking some kind of psychometric test. And a psychometric doesn't definitively say you are X, you are Y, you are Z. What it does is it gives you some feedback to be able to work upon, to test it and to say, oh yeah, that's what I do, don't I? That's what I'm like. Oh yeah, I'm good at that. I can do these sorts of things. Maybe I should give myself more opportunity to do these more frequently.
Thank you, Paul. We're almost at time there, but that's a very neat segue. I just want to say that the chat in the group is very, very good. I think there's some really interesting points there about teams within teams and about managing up and managing down. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. So if you've got questions, please send them in to me. My email address will be at the very end, and I invited you to the webinar. If you've got questions, we'll try and answer them offline. Just a quick reminder that the that one of the talks that Paul's referencing by Courtney was Understanding Your Leadership DNA, and that's available through our YouTube channel, as are all the other webinars. So again, if you want to be sent a link to those webinars, let me know and we'll send that out to you. So I think, Dane, are you back online? I think we're pretty much done for the session.
Yes, that's it. I think I want to thank Paul and thank yourself for making this run quite smoothly now. And thank you everyone for contributing in the chat function as well. I think it's been a fantastic webinar.
Can I just say
Paul?
that I really appreciate the comments, and I would be more than happy to engage with people about issues and comments and so on and so forth. I'd love to do that. I'd love to see you all in a workshop. Of course I would, but if that's not your thing, then I'm still happy to receive comments and debating points and so on and so forth, because it all helps me as well understand your own lived realities as well. So I'll just encourage you to carry on doing that.
Thank you, Paul. I think it's a very generous offer as well, I think. So by all means, please take that up. So yes, we can just say thank you and stay safe, and we will leave that there because I know lots of you have got other Zooms to get onto. So thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.